there's just a massive spiritual sickness across the political spectrum because everybody's sitting on their social media feeds and they instantly are seeing the lives of every billionaire out there, every celebrity out there. They're portraying their own lives in the most positive light they possibly can with filters. And so everybody's constantly has a barrage of all the things that they don't have. I think it's much more difficult for you to be happy with what you have today than in the past because you have all of that right in front of you.
Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Richie McGinniss. Subscribe at undercurrents.tv to join the Undercurrents community. It's just $1 for your first month. You get all kinds of cool stuff, paywalled episodes, and an email address where you can communicate with us, ask us questions, and we can answer them on future episodes. So undercurrents.tv if you want to subscribe. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts as well. Let's get on to the news now. It's not getting a ton of media attention, but the left is managing to cobble together a small, quote-unquote, resistance as Donald Trump and Elon Musk embark on a self-described, quote, revolution here in Washington, D.C. Just in the last few days, a protest in Rhode Island, as just one example, drew a pretty decent crowd. Senator Chris Murphy posted video of another decent crowd that he seems to have drawn in Connecticut just over the last few days. Hundreds reportedly took to the streets in Chicago. Some student protests seem to be picking back up as well. Here's more. Take a look at this video, judge for yourself, from New York, Florida, Seattle, and Washington, D.C., just in the last several days. Last week, we marveled that Trump via Musk is rapidly gutting the bureaucracy, and all Democrats can muster is a goofy press conference outside USAID here in D.C. Back in 2017, this city, Washington, burned during Trump's inauguration. We forget that, but it's true. The Women's March obviously swept the city. Now, it's different today, and for many reasons that people are kind of trying to figure out. Is the left demoralized? Did lawfare's failure just kill the resistance? Is it underfunded? Is it less threatened, even as Donald Trump seems more powerful? This time, in Trump 1.0, a big resistance movement, you'll remember, was coalescing with millions of dollars behind it and a whole lot of power in newsrooms and boardrooms. Now, a New York Times story recently looked back on those days, writing, quote, "This was the moment of all-encompassing high-stakes political stances in which people looked out to see good always fighting evil, the far right taking up its tiki torches or Antifa roving the streets, and culture turned into perpetual tinderbox. It was, at times, a performance art, and notably mimetic. Its MAGA caps and pussy hats belong to the same lineage of letting absolute strangers know exactly what your values are." Now here's more from the New York Times. Quote, "In 2025, everything is different. The protests are relatively muted. Few Democrats talk about impeachment or sustain their alarm over incipient fascism, even with Elon Musk possibly gesticulating like a Nazi. For all the spectacle of Trump, this inauguration was ultimately a rather ordinary one." That story in the Times suggested this Manichaean framing of fascism versus anti-fascism has lost its power. It made me think of my friend Richie McGinniss, actually, who is a wild reporter. He traveled the country in those years, documenting the rise and fall of Antifa, the militant anti-fascist Trump resistance, but also the fringe Trump supporters who were organizing too. He wrote an electric book about all of it recently called The Riot Diet, One Man's Radical Ride Through America in Chaos. And Richie, unlike almost anybody else, knows the people who resisted. And he knows the people who resisted the resistors. He saw it inside of their organizations. So I wanted to ask him where they all went, especially as videos came out over the weekend and in the last few days of people starting to put something together. Why is DC relatively quiet compared with 2017, as Trump and Musk, by their own description, foment a revolution to the structure of government? Will this peace last? Is there something more going on? I was lucky to sit down with Richie McGinniss to have a nice long conversation diving into really what was the cause of people going out in the streets in such big numbers in those early Trump years, and whether or not there's something maybe lurking under the surface that we're starting to see bubble up, and that is something the New York Times referred to those years as a quote, tinderbox. Are all the ingredients to that tinderbox still here? Richie sat down with me, again, for a nice long-form conversation that I really enjoyed to help us dig into some of these videos that we've seen and what could be lurking under the surface. Richie McGinniss, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Now, I want to start with what's happening at this very moment, because just in recent days, Democratic politicians have been out in the streets trying desperately to mobilize people on the left over USAID. They've been screaming in the streets near the White House and not really growing much of a crowd. You've been, as we're going to talk about, at all of the recent demonstrations, every different flavor of demonstration, whether it's peaceful, sort of mainstream,
Spicy.
normie left, Antifa, or Patriot Front we were talking about before we started recording. So why right now, as Donald Trump retakes office, Elon Musk is, slashing and burning through the federal government, are Democrats not able to bring people into the streets? What's your theory on that?
Well, I think there's like a fatigue after 8 years, and obviously the 4 years under Trump, there was a lot of protest, and the left of the media has been basically screaming hysterically for the last 8 years that Orange Man bad. And I think at a certain point, if it's a 5-alarm fire for 8 years, you just kind of get tired. And so, I mean, we saw, I think the perfect example of that was the Women's March that this time around, it was like 1/10 the size that it was in 2017. So I think that's a great example of it's much more difficult to mobilize. And also the fact that Trump won the popular vote this time. So, there's no more screaming about Russian collusion, et cetera. I mean, it's pretty clear that Trump not only won, but that MAGA is now essentially mainstream. So if it is mainstream, then I think it's difficult to really say, that this guy is going to destroy democracy.
You were at the Women's March. You were at some of the genuinely peaceful George Floyd marches. There was a lot of talk about fascism then, which is interesting because you've been at all of the anti-fascist riots too. Not literally all of them, but as close to all of them as basically anybody can get. And it seems to me that when we look back, that question of fascism was not just animating the fringe left, but also the normie, sort of mainstream left. Is that when you were talking to people at the Women's March or George Floyd protests? Is that right? Were people really animated specifically by that? And why might they not now?
Yeah, so punch a Nazi in the face was a very popular thing that was said at those protests. And this idea that every Trump supporter is a Nazi, it's now like, okay, so the majority of American voters are now Nazis. It just doesn't compute anymore. But I think also secondarily, the fact of the matter is in 2020, what we saw was actual collusion between the United States intelligence services and big tech to keep Trump out of office. And last I checked, fascism is a symbiosis between the private and public sectors. And if you look at the public sector, obviously our intelligence agencies are more powerful than they've ever been before. And secondarily, that big tech, these platforms, are way more powerful than any private industry has ever been in history in terms of shaping public perception. So you have these two massive entities colluding with each other to keep somebody out of office. And I think after what happened in 2020, the way that history works is that people, on a long enough timeline start to, the wool can be over their eyes for so long before they're like, wait a second. The southern border is another great example. For 4 years under Biden, they're saying, oh, nope, don't look here. There's nothing's wrong. And I was down there in March of 2021, right after Biden took office, sounding the alarm of this is crazy. I can see the people, they're coming in through the gaps in the wall. The parts of the wall that were not constructed yet, there were literally pieces of the wall, thousands and thousands stacked up along the southern border, and Biden ordered them just not another inch. So there were contracts that were paid out. People were sitting in construction trailers getting paid to twiddle their thumbs. And after 3 years, it wasn't until those migrants started showing up to Democrat cities that people started saying, wait a second, this could be a problem. So by the time the election came around, I think people realized this is probably the highest that immigration ever was on the list of priorities for voters. So I think that definitely helped Trump win.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I wanted to ask you about another theory I've seen floated around is that corporations were bankrolling so many of these, like Women's March, Normie protests. And I don't know exactly what corporate funding fed into the Women's March in particular, but was that the sense that you got when you were traveling around, that there were, from George Floyd to even the Women's March and some of those early Trump year, anti-Russia gate, whatever, that they had some corporate funding or the backing of big groups like ACLU maybe?
Yeah, it's really difficult. So, like with Antifa, for example, if you go up to somebody and you say, hey, are you Antifa? 99 out of 100 times, they're not going to say yes. So in the book, I call them the umbrella gang because they wear all black. They bring umbrellas specifically to defend themselves against a confrontation with police.
I thought it was like a Mary Poppins.
Yeah, exactly.
Jumping off buildings.
Sometimes, there was some comedy there with like using an umbrella to try to whack a cop with riot gear. It doesn't really work. It's like using a toothpick to try to cut steak. But so the funding part, like as far as people actually on the ground, like nobody's going to tell you, oh yeah, like I got paid to come here. With that being said, in the book I discuss a lot about specifically like Seattle is a great example. We're in Seattle and we're marching to the West Precinct. The East Precinct was Carmen Best, the police commissioner, said, hey, we're going to abandon this precinct in the spirit of de-escalation. They created a power vacuum, 6 blocks in a major American city where cops were not allowed. The first thing they did was build barriers, not walls, but barriers along the checkpoints and put armed guards there. So they're not going to call it a wall, obviously, because that would be, too Trumpy. But that tells you everything you need to know about how exactly these power vacuums function. It's like the strongest person is the one who's going to reign supreme. And so we march from that East Precinct, where the Chaz was, to the West Precinct, which is in the commercial district downtown. And it's a little 2-story police precinct, and it's surrounded by massive skyscrapers. And everybody was giving the finger to the cops inside of that precinct. Except we were literally, the sun was setting, we were in the shadow of the 3-tower Amazon complex. And Amazon effectively doubled their revenue during the pandemic while all these small businesses were shuttered. And Amazon, Starbucks, Microsoft, Boeing, all of these companies, massive multinational companies that are centered in Seattle, headquartered there, were running BLM ads, selling BLM shirts, and signaling their support for the movement. Now, when that power vacuum turned violent after a couple of weeks and 2 black kids, 19 and a 16-year-old black kids were killed in the Chaz, in that power vacuum, by the armed guards at the checkpoints. They shuttered the Chaz, and guess what? I looked it up. I couldn't find any evidence of those companies donating to those kids' families. So it was a way, that you had the Occupy movement about 10 years prior, when people were mobilizing against the banks and the massive multinational corporations. And I think they said to themselves a decade later, well, if you can't beat them, join them. So they really talk about pulling the wool over the eyes, saying, oh, we donate all this money to Black Lives Matter and similar black charities in favor of Black Americans. But the fact of the matter is like if you look at Black Lives Matter as an organization, it was incredibly corrupt. And very little of that money was actually reaching the grassroots groups that were in these cities. So like the after action when I was writing the book, it was infuriating, just examining the way in which many of my friends were in Washington, D.C. Like people really, I don't think that the majority of people had bad intentions going out there. But with that being said, I think that they were manipulated by the corporate media and by the massive corporations that were like, well, as long as they're pointing the finger at the cops as the bad guys, then we stay out of the crosshairs. So,
and that's, it seems to me, at least at the time, was for racial reasons, because a lot of like elite white liberals in corporate media did not want to look like they were on the wrong side of the cops versus average American dispute.
I don't know if you remember that like Instagram trend when people were putting black boxes on their Instagram. So everybody's sitting at home, lockdown, and they put the black box on their Instagram and then they feel all warm and fuzzy. But it's like, what does that actually do to solve the problems that we have in the country? Furthermore, it's not just a racial issue. The gap between the rich and the poor is wider than it's ever been before, and since the Gilded Age, and it's a class-based issue. So as long as everybody's focused on race, then they're not paying attention to the fact that that gap is getting wider and wider, and race is a component, but I would argue that it's not the most essential component, and it's not what we need to focus on if we're going to come together as Americans and actually fix some problems.
So before we get too deep into what might happen in the future, I want to start actually with your remarkable Forrest Gump-like history through the last wild decade in American politics. Because, Richie, you started, and you can tell us more about this, but you started going deep into this world around the time, this was late Obama administration, if I'm remembering correctly, when there were other sort of Black Lives Matter protests around Ferguson and here in Baltimore, up just a little bit further from where we are right now in Baltimore. And that did really lay the foundation for what we saw. But you've also been at a lot of far-right demonstrations. People may remember you. You may look familiar to people from the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, which unfortunately you were pulled into because of some heroic work that you did on the ground. But tell us just a little bit about how you got into this world and where that took you.
Well, I moved to DC in 2008. And at the time, I decided that I was going to study Arabic because I remember the moment I read this Washington Post op-ed that Barack Obama wrote in the summer of 2008. And he promised that he was going to pull all the troops out of Iraq by 2010. And I had gotten into Georgetown, which has a great Arabic program. And so I decided to study Middle Eastern history in Arabic, thinking I'm going to be part of this whole new foreign policy agenda in the Middle East and, kind of fix things up over there. And in studying it over the 4 years from 2008 to 2012, I really decided I don't agree with anything our government is doing over there. And secondarily, Obama is really perpetuating the neoconservative agenda that I was so opposed to initially. And so I think people always attribute, the populist movement to Trump specifically, but I would argue that the groundwork was laid far before that. And the groundwork was laid by the Obama administration, which was focused on identity politics and really becoming, the Democrat Party was evolving into the party of the corporatocracy rather than the party of the working class. And I think over the course of those 8 years, that's really when the transition started, and which gave Trump the window. Everyone calls Trump the disease, but he was a symptom and offering a cure to the class disparities that I was talking about. So right after Trump won, I went and interviewed for a job at the Daily Caller, where you also previously worked, and the Caller.
I've never actually worked at the Caller.
Oh, you never worked there? You just were in there.
Common misconception.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, no, just hung out with
good.
you guys a lot.
Yeah, good, because that's good. You don't want that on your resume. But
no, it was just a hanger on.
Yeah, but the newsroom. I mean, I walked in there, and when I was working at MSNBC, the newsroom was like a funeral home. Like everybody was afraid to say what they thought, and it was such a hierarchy there that, if you're a PA, you just stand and just do your job, serve the coffee, and take what's coming across the AP Newswire and aggregate it, and we'll do the 5 stories are going to be on every single show, and we're going to talk about the same thing over and over again. And there was no independent thinking going on there. I walked into the Daily Caller newsroom, and it was like the first chapter in the book is called The Most Riotous Newsroom in DC, because people are screaming at each other. You got interns standing up saying, I think this, and then I started the video program there. At the time, it was just one other guy, and I took a big pay cut to work twice as much, leaving Levin TV as a video editor to really build a video team out at the Caller, because they had this huge front page, they had a huge Facebook presence, and the video really, that was right when digital video was not only getting monetized, but also accessible to people on their mobile devices. So as I built the team out there.
And this is when Facebook was really monetizing
yes,
Facebook
it was
Live,
right when it started. Exactly.
Right.
Yep. Right after Trump won, it was like, there was just crazy eyeballs on the Daily Caller videos that were being produced. And I was like, okay, I can contribute something here. We can improve the production value. We can create kind of a little mini news network, video network within this print network that's online. And so I built the team out to like 10 people. Fast forward to the pandemic. When it started, I actually flew to Hawaii. And the second chapter is called Apocalypse is Nigh in Kauai, because I was like, oh, there's waves on the horizon. My buddy lives over there, and look at how cheap flights are. I didn't really know it was coming. This is early March. So I flew out there, and our entire business collapsed literally overnight. And so our revenue went out the window, 90% of it on Facebook and YouTube. Our bread and butter was like going out on the ground and filming a lot of the protests that had happened over the course of the Trump's first term, and just going out, man, on the streets, in person type stuff with young kids who are just have their cell phones, And the moment the pandemic hit, it's like nobody wants to watch a bunch of 20-somethings sit in their rooms and talk about COVID.
Sure.
So when our revenue went out the window, I came back and I was trying to pick up the pieces and keep from having to fire my entire team that I had spent the last 3-4 years building. And when the protests started and when there were a lot of riots on that first weekend, Memorial Day weekend.
The first George Floyd weekend.
Yes, exactly. Right. So it was Minneapolis, but also D.C. And Shelby Talcott, who was my coworker at the time.
She was just on the show.
Yeah, yep. Former pro tennis player, tough girl.
Yep.
Tough girl.
She's remarkable.
Yes, she is remarkable and definitely a lot tougher than I was. And that's outlined in the book. Like I'm like getting emotional and she's just like totally stoic the whole time.
They got arrested. Yes.
And that was the one trip that I did not go on.
That's right.
My Irish luck. I was like, oh, the one I didn't go to, they're in Louisville, and here's Jorge's Instagram. Yep, he's got handcuffs.
Yeah.
And so I spent that whole night trying to bail them out of jail with our boss, Jeff.
And it worked.
Yeah. It took more time than Shelby was not happy, and she had every right to not be happy. But we kept calling. I was like talking to Shelby's dad, trying to, figure out how we could get in touch with the jail and get her out of jail. But so Shelby and Jorge Ventura, who was an unpaid intern at the time. He had just come from a community college in Palmdale, California. And he was like, I'll do anything, man. And that was 3 days before all of these riots and protests started. So that first weekend I was in New York and I saw Shelby and Jorge filming the madness in front of the White House. There was a fire set next to St. John's Church. Jorge recorded Leland Vittert, who was at the time at Fox News, getting assaulted by a mob that was also trying to basically scale the fence.
Yeah.
The Secret Service were like literally whacking them with billy clubs, getting bricks thrown at them. And there was looting happening in the surrounding area. And Shelby and Jorge, with just their cell phones, were able to record all these moments that the corporate media with their big cameras, very conspicuous, couldn't. And so I came down on that Monday morning and I was a block up from St. John's Church when the Bible photo op happened. And the hysteria that happened around that is just like completely detached from reality, claiming that Trump was the guy who ordered them to shoot tear gas and rubber bullets. By the way, they don't use tear gas. They're not allowed to use tear gas in Lafayette Square. They used what would be more accurately described as like a smoke bomb. It's like a
feels like tear gas, though.
Yeah, well, it feels like tear gas. It's irritating, but the tear gas in Portland. I was there right
after they did that day, and it felt like tear gas.
It definitely stings. It definitely. And I'm not saying that like it's nothing.
I'm sure you've had both. I'm sure you've had both.
But the tear gas in Portland, as Shelby put it, it hits different. It hits way different. You need a gas mask for that.
Interesting.
Because it's CS gas, so it's a chemical-based gas, and so they. Also, the rubber bullets weren't used. They were using pepper balls, which are like little paintballs that are this almost like a little plastic irritant that explodes, and it'll. In any event, I've been hit with rubber bullets. I've been hit with pepper balls, and it's like comparing a pool noodle to a baseball bat. Like a rubber bullet is a lot more powerful. All that to say that the hysteria that was drummed up around that Bible photo op really set the stage for the entire Summer of Love.
Interesting.
Where everybody just got. Like I was talking about, as a 5-alarm fire, we need to stop this now. And Trump's bringing in it's the same story in every city. It's like the Democrat mayor or governor says, we're not going to let Trump and his fascist police force come in here. And they capitulated to the protesters. And in the case of Seattle, it was probably the most extreme case, but also Portland, DC, New York, where they allowed them to have these occupied protests and create this little power vacuum, their own little fiefdom.
Yeah,
little camps.
And Chaz encampments, basically.
Yeah, and they were literally sleeping there. So in New York, they were sleeping over. People were sleeping over in BLM Plaza. There was a little camp across from the federal courthouse in Portland. And it was the same story in every place, which is basically the left is saying, well, the police are bad, so we're going to reduce their presence. And then, anybody who tries to restore law and order, you're a fascist. So...
Manichaean, fascist and anti-fascist.
Yes, exactly. And that's the way that I think our news has really come out of the toothpaste has come out of the tube in the Trump era. Is like it's a totally bipolar situation where everything that's happening on the ground is viewed through this binary lens of either they're mostly entirely peaceful or they're BLM terrorists. And the fact of the matter is, it was the same in every single city. You have a massive group of people, a couple thousand people will come out and they'll demonstrate before the sun sets. And as the sun goes down, that massive group of people who are out there for good intentions, we can talk about, whether or not that, it actually achieved anything, but they would start to filter home after the sunset. And then when the cops came out, there was a smaller group of people who were specifically there to agitate police and create a spectacle and get their cause out, and the bigger the spectacle, the better off you are. And then there were also a whole nother group of people who would use that power vacuum as an opportunity to loot and just burn stuff down for the sake of burning stuff down. So, and the same thing happened with January 6th, which I also covered, which is then the whole thing just got flipped on its head, where it's like, that's the same story was true. There's a massive group of people, the overwhelming majority were nonviolent. And then there's a much smaller group of people who agitate the police. And the moment the tear gas and the pepper spray comes out, if you get pepper sprayed directly in the face, your frontal cortex isn't what's doing the thinking. It's the base of your brain. It's your lizard brain that starts doing the thinking. And that when that fight or flight comes out, it's really hard to make rational decisions. So everybody's sitting at home, they should have done this, those idiots, they should have done that. But fact of the matter is once you're in that situation, you're getting whacked by a billy club and you've got pepper spray in your eyes. It's pretty hard to make a rational decision.
Well, I want to know, because you write in the book about standing shoulder to shoulder with so many of these people. And you just, before we started taping, talked about the lost souls. And I want to know who these people are, both on the left and the right. And we'll start on the left, because I'm also curious, where they are now. But tell us, from Portland to Kenosha, there were, I guess, where else were you? Portland, Kenosha, Minneapolis, DC?
Yeah, New York, and then I went back to Portland for Proud Boys. I went to the border right before the election. I went to Rudy Giuliani's apartment to get the Hunter Biden laptop, which is an experience in and of itself. And just so the viewers know, the first book covers the BLM stuff, and the second book, which covers all the MAGA side of things, and the Stop the Steal, the election, the Stop the Steals in DC, and then January 6th. It's really like the perfect sequel because it's the same story on both sides. But to answer your question about the people who are out there on the left, certainly a group that was younger than the group on the right, largely. And I think a lot of disaffected youth who have graduated college or high school and they feel like they don't have the opportunities that were afforded to their parents. And so it wasn't so much that, they were told by the media that, it was a righteous cause, but also secondarily, there's just a massive, I think, spiritual sickness across the political spectrum because everybody's sitting on their social media feeds and they instantly are seeing the lives of every billionaire out there, every celebrity out there, and they're portraying their own lives in the most positive light they possibly can with filters. And so everybody's constantly has a barrage of all the things that they don't have. And I think it's much more difficult for you to be happy with what you have today than in the past because you have all of that right in front of you.
Was that why it was worse during the pandemic, or it felt worse?
Well, definitely the pandemic itself, I think it accelerated things. That's very obvious that people were pent up for months in their houses. Small businesses were shuttered and everybody was told, hey, you got to put a mask on, you got to do this, you got to do that. And so I think that just put everything on steroids when finally the media was saying, okay, you can go out there for this. You can't go out to run your business. You can't go to church. I cite Bill de Blasio, who had a quote which approximated to, it was right in the peak of everything in July of 2020. He said, religious services, they don't... they're
not essential, something like
they're
that.
not as essential as 400 years of racism and slavery. So basically saying, if you want to go to church, you can't. But if you want to go out and protest, you can. And he told the COVID tracers not to trace people who went to the protests. So everybody was getting traced. Everybody was getting held accountable for not following the rules unless you were out there for a protest. So the autonomous zone in New York was much less violent than the other ones because the NYPD was, it's just a much more condensed area. It was a much smaller space. And it was kind of like a block party. It was where people went just to let their hair down and just breathe some fresh air. And there was a moment in that protest where they came in, what they would do overnight is put a bunch of barriers in the street to obstruct the traffic. And where it was is right in front of New York City Hall, where the Brooklyn Bridge empties from Long Island into Manhattan. So it's a massive thoroughfare for commuters and for people coming into New York. And so overnight, they'd stack everything up in there to block traffic coming in, and then the NYPD would come in and clear it out. And they were asking for $1 billion reduction to the NYPD's budget. And the night before the deadline, they just built these massive barriers, and the NYPD came in and cleared it all out. They forced everybody back into the autonomous zone, this little area, and everybody's tucked in there with their umbrellas and their shields and their goggles. And there was like a no man's land in between the police shields, which were basically had opened the streets back up, and the traffic was now running behind them. And I was walking in the no man's land between the two groups, and there was this black guy wearing a dress and a red wig. Mm-hmm. And by all exterior appearances, you would have thought he's going to be yelling at the cops. And he just said, "You guys are just trying to feed your family." And he turned around to the protesters and he said, "And all you guys want to do is do drugs and create chaos." Mm-hmm. And so that for me was enigmatic of America itself, because as much as we can get manipulated by the media, as much as we, want to have approval from our political tribe, ultimately we are free to express ourselves in the way that we see fit. And so, this guy that would be like the epitome to left-wing media of a BLM demonstrator, mm-hmm. he had the opposite view.
And you really only capture stuff like that on the ground. Mm-hmm. Now, tell us, I know this is book 2, but you just said something interesting, which is that it was the same story on both sides. And I'm really curious about that, because I'm sure there are differences. You said, the left tends to be younger. But when you say it's the same story on both sides, flesh it out a little bit. Is it about economics? Is it about spirituality? There's people are spiritually bankrupt or literally bankrupt, a combination. What is it that's the same on both sides?
Well, certainly there's a monetary aspect to it. Mm-hmm. It's obviously becoming more and more difficult for Americans to have what would be the kind of stereotypical American dream, the white picket fence, the car, and the family. Obviously, younger people are having less kids because I think it's much more difficult just to have the economic means to do that. Secondarily, you have the police, who are the custodians of the system. Yeah. And so on the one side, it was, okay, the police are bad because they oppress this particular race or this particular class. And on the other side, it was the police are bad because initially they were the Back the Blue crowd. Mm-hmm. But I cite the escalation of violence from the election to Stop the Steal 1 to Stop the Steal 2. And the Proud Boys all came to Stop the Steal 2 in great numbers. And there was a moment where they basically started clashing with police, saying, if you guys are going to enforce this election, then you're now our enemy. Mm-hmm. And so by January 6th, I don't think that the majority of that crowd would say, oh yeah, it's good to beat up on cops. But like I said, once that chaos starts, right, it's really hard to make rational decisions. Once you see your fellow tribes member get billy club down to the ground, it only takes a couple of agitators to start that snowball effect, mm-hmm, before all of a sudden you've got tear gas in your eyes, you got pepper spray in your eyes, and you're not making rational choices, and you get a billy club smashed on your hand just because, I think those people, a lot of them, yeah, it's a battle. And a lot of them, like by the time I got there, right at 2 p.m., as the clashes were really escalating on the western front of the Capitol, all of the fences and the signs that said no trespassing had been trampled. So I saw one that was trampled into the grass, but when there's 10,000 people marching and you're just following the crowd, it's really hard for people at home to realize like just how that all just unfolds so quickly. And there were a lot of people who just watched people going up. They're from like Kentucky or they're from wherever. And they're like, oh man, check this out. I'm in the Capitol. And like, they didn't know, we live in DC. We know what the Capitol is. We know you need credentials to get in there, which I had. But a lot of people did walk in, and a lot of people, a smaller group of people fought their way in. So the same thing was true on both sides, which is that nuance was just totally cast to the side by the media in favor of having the narrative that their audience wants to hear.
Well, and I just want to pause there because, so I was at that west side of the Capitol around 1 p.m. And what you just said, I think, is probably the least understood thing about January 6th. And I mean that from the right, too, which is that genuine Trump-supporting, decent people in some cases got caught up in awful behavior, and it was organic. It was real. Like, people were actually really upset, and these are genuine Trump supporters, not just feds. We do know that there were informants in the crowd, but these were real people, and they were really caught up in it, and you could see it happening, exactly what you described. And I'm curious for your perspective, on the left and the right, What is it that takes a person? Many people are dealing with the economic constraints of this version of America 2025, 2020, whatever it is. What takes a person from I'm filing for bankruptcy, there's a lien on my house, to I'm going to physically go to a demonstration, I'm going to join the Proud Boys, I'm going to join Antifa, and now that I've joined, I'm going to riot. What is it that what switches flip? Why? What is that?
Well, I think Kenosha is the perfect example, because you have Kyle Rittenhouse, who went out there, and I interviewed him 14 minutes before the shooting.
So this was a George Floyd protest outside of Milwaukee, actually not far from where I grew up, but in Wisconsin. This was the summer of 2020, August, I think.
August 25th was the shooting.
You are there. Now, just so people, if people forgot what Kenosha
I can take people through. So basically, it was very similar to the George Floyd situation, where Jacob Blake was a guy from Kenosha who he had 3 kids with his baby mama, and there was a warrant out for his arrest for domestic abuse of the mother of his kids. And he returned to that house, and she called the police and said he's here. And the police knew that he had a warrant out for his arrest. And when they arrived, he fought with the police. His kids were in the car, a vehicle that was parked next to the house, and he forcibly fought with cops. He was tased twice. And then as he tried to fight his way into the vehicle, he was shot 7 times. It was 4 times in the back and 3 times in the side. And the video that came out of that was just the very end of him wrestling away from police and getting shot. And so what everybody saw and what mobilized the whole Kenosha protest / riot was that video that didn't show the tasing. It didn't cite the fact that he had a warrant out for arrest, or that he, according to police, was armed with a knife, or the fact that the narrative that came out from Joe Biden and Kamala Harris was he was shot 7 times in the back in front of his kids. But what they didn't cite is the fact that, he wrestled with police, and that the car that he was entering, those kids, their mom had called 911 on Jacob Blake. And it wasn't 7 times in the back. It was 4 times in the back and 3 times in the side.
He survived remarkably.
And he survived remarkably. And so that was on that Sunday morning. I think it was the 23rd. And people went out to protest the first night. And a bunch of local streamers, Kristen Harris being the main one, I saw his footage of everybody getting pushed away from the courthouse because the police were protecting the courthouse. And when they entered the surrounding commercial districts, they just started burning things. A lot of people came. It wasn't just locals who were there. They knew that this protest was going to be a power vacuum.
People traveled.
So there were a lot of younger people who came from other areas, Milwaukee, Chicago, and they just viewed it as an opportunity to paint the town. And the economic thing is there, but also when you have a power vacuum like that, then chaos will reign supreme, and the worst of the worst will come out of the woodwork in order to
be part of
stuff
something?
down. Yeah, and also just to tear things down. But
is the charitable version of that like they want to tear things down because they want to feel like they're part of something, because they don't?
Yeah, or just because they just have nothing else going for them. I mean, that's such a small group of people. So let's say the second night of rioting, there were maybe 1,000 people in front of the courthouse, and maybe 1/10 of them or less were actually breaking windows of cars and lighting them on fire. And same as January 6th, it only takes a couple of agitators to create that situation where you have fires everywhere. And so on the second night of rioting, we arrived that afternoon, and all of the surrounding areas, again, were getting burned. There were just entire car lots and buildings burning to the ground. And Shelby and I were walking through that area, and there was an auto business where they had guys, literally a guy using a power washer, and then other people using buckets and trash cans to put out vehicle fires. And we asked him, hey, why are you out here putting out these fires? And he just simply turned around, stopped the power washer, and was like, you see the fire department? And we were like, I guess not. The fire department was there, but there were so many fires that they could only handle so much. This city is not used to dealing with that kind of chaos. And so the next night, they built a fence around the courthouse. The National Guard was there, but all the police were doing was defending the courthouse and the municipal buildings in that area. And again, they pushed him out into the commercial district and they started burning stuff. And I went back into the hotel to get internet service and tweet out all of that whole rigmarole of the police pushing people away. And I saw Kyle Rittenhouse, among other people, armed individuals in front of the same business.
He was, what, 18, 19?
He was 17.
17 years
17.
old.
And
a white guy from Northern Illinois?
So he was from Kenosha, and he lived in Antioch, which is like 10 minutes away.
Yeah.
So this whole narrative, and we can get into that, the narrative that was spun up after the shooting, but just to take people back to that moment, I was like, I dropped what I was doing. I was like, this is an extension of the story from the previous night. We had the volunteer fire brigade, and now we have the volunteer police force out there defending the business because the police weren't doing anything to defend that city. And Kyle was from the area. And so he viewed it as he's out there to defend the business, to defend his town, the community. He was out cleaning graffiti that afternoon off of the high school, which is right up the street from where that business was. And he also had a med kit. And so when I walked out, I told police the night of that I thought he was just like a baby-faced 20-something, because I couldn't imagine somebody that young would be out there with a rifle and a med kit. And he told me that he was an EMT. He was not. He was a lifeguard. But he was out there with the intention of not only defending the business, but also helping the protesters with his medical kit.
Sure.
So he said, hey, do you want to go out? I'm going to go see if anybody needs medical attention. And so he was out there with good intentions. And the reason why I think Kenosha is a good example of, and it's enigmatic of the entire chaos on both sides, is because he went into that situation with good intentions. Mm-hmm. But when the toothpaste comes out of the tube, things get bad quick, and bad things can happen to people who are out there. And people who are out there with all good intentions can end up committing acts of violence. Well, Kyle was attacked by, as we were walking through, Joseph Rosenbaum, who I didn't know at the time. I hadn't even seen him. Mm-hmm. He emerged from a dark part of the street and he screamed, and Kyle heard him and he ran away, and there was a gunshot that went off. Kyle turned around. Rosenbaum threw a bag at him. I heard glass shatter, and Kyle was standing there with the gun aimed 45 degrees at the ground, and Rosenbaum continued to pursue him. And I was running behind them with my camera up, thinking that my phone was recording. I had called Shelby the moment that I saw Kyle running down the street, actually with not only his AR, but also a fire extinguisher to put out fires in another car source business. It was the same owner, another business just up the street from where I had interviewed him. And I said, something's about to go down. I don't know what's up. Where are you?
But you could feel it.
I could feel it, yeah. I mean, I saw him sprinting, and I just was like, something's about to go down. That was the moment that Rosenbaum started screaming, and I said, expletive, and I got to hang up. And I hung up, and I pulled out my camera app, and I took a photo of the ground. So I thought I was filming at the time. After the shooting, I told police I have the footage of the shooting, look, and I realized that I had just taken a photo of the ground, and I didn't capture that moment. So as Rosenbaum continued to pursue Rittenhouse, this all happened in a matter of seconds, where he continued to run. Kyle was standing there, and he screamed F you, and he lunged for the gun. And I was like 15 feet behind them. And Kyle dodged around and shot 4 shots in 0.7 seconds. And I told police the night of that, number one, that I stepped to the side right when the shooting went off. Turns out after reviewing the video, I stepped to the side after the shooting. So I told myself in my own mind, like, maybe to give myself agency in that situation.
But you remembered it differently.
But yeah, and so I talk about that in the book of how I remembered it versus what happened once I saw the video. And Rosenbaum collapsed, and I told police that I looked down at my legs because I felt something go past them. And I told the police, like, did I just get effing shot? And I stamped my legs, and I was like, no, I'm good. And I think you can see, actually, the FBI had an infrared camera in a Cessna above the shooting. And this didn't come out until a year later. And all the conservatives were saying, oh, they named me as a victim because I told police that. I didn't ask the prosecution to make me a victim, but they said, oh, he's making it up. He says like a bullet went past him, but that's BS. And he's just trying to whatever. And then the left was saying, oh, he's just trying to get Kyle off. And meanwhile, I just told police literally hours after I witnessed this shooting, like what I experienced from my own perspective. And the infrared footage shows the heat signature of that bullet skipping off the ground a year later. So that all of that was not settled until the trial. I have questions about why they waited an entire year, because the public was arguing back and forth about this shooting for that entire time. And it would have settled a lot if we had have seen that footage previously, because it clearly showed Rosenbaum running after him.
And you tried to save Rosenbaum's
Yeah, so,
life?
and I, after the shooting, I told police, well, I didn't see him collapse to the ground because I looked down at my legs. And then I looked back up and Rosenbaum was lying on the ground and Kyle was gone. So I ran over to Rosenbaum and I went to flip him over. He had been shot at close range. I assumed there was like a big exit wound somewhere. As it turns out, he was shot right in the top of his back. There was a tiny little hole and it went straight down parallel with his body, and shattered his lung, exploded his lung, his pelvis. He was choking on his own blood. And I didn't realize that Kyle ran up around the car and behind me. And so I just saw a pair of legs and was like, what are you doing? Call 911. And I saw a hand reach into a pocket. I don't think I would have screamed in that way at that individual if I had known it was Kyle with a still smoking rifle. But turns out he called his friend and there was a mob approaching. So, you know, I wouldn't fault Kyle Rittenhouse for running away. But, you know, at the same time, just because somebody's not guilty doesn't mean that I need to feel good about what happened. And I don't, because I didn't know who Joseph Rosenbaum was at the time. I didn't know the crimes that he had committed.
Well, tell us about what we know now, because we're discussing this in the context of something really interesting you said, and this is in the book, about how Kenosha is sort of the embodiment of lost souls on both sides. Rosenbaum is there with the protesters, but he's sort of an interesting figure.
Well, interesting would be an understatement.
Well, it's interesting how he ends up in the place that he ends up.
Well, so Joseph Rosenbaum, and this all didn't come out until days later when the criminal complaint came out and he was named along with Kyle Rittenhouse. It turns out that he sexually abused multiple minors and was convicted of that. And one side, you know, called him a pedo who deserved what he got. The other side was citing him as a martyr of BLM. And the same thing with Kyle Rittenhouse. One side called him a white supremacist. The other side called him a hero. As it turns out, if you look at the deeper story, and this is not to excuse anything like that, but it's, if you're going to understand a tragedy, you have to look deeper than just that surface level narrative that came out of it, which
context,
is, And so Joseph Rosenbaum was sexually abused by his own stepdad. And then the kids that he sexually abused, some of them are in jail for the same crime. And the second guy shot, Anthony Huber, he had an absent father. He's the guy who hit Kyle with the skateboard, and skateboarding was his only solace. And Gage Groskowitz, absent father, and Kyle's father lived locally, but he was the only time that I heard of Kyle's father being part of the picture was the fact that he left drunken messages on Kyle's lawyer's answering machine. So between all four of those people, from Kyle to the three men shot, and Jacob Blake, for that matter, all of them had broken homes. And Jacob Blake and Anthony Huber's father came out of the woodwork after the tragedy and said, oh, I want to sue the government. I want my money. And fact of the matter is they weren't around for their kids when they needed it. And so not only is Kenosha, as far as the actual human beings that were there, enigmatic of those lost souls who were looking for a cause and a reason and a purpose, but also the city itself rivaled Detroit in the early 1900s. And it actually preceded the Model T Ford. It was called the Rambler, and later Nash Automotive. There was a big plant there that was building cars at the turn of the century. And it eventually became a Chrysler plant, and that plant shut down in the 70s. And when you go to Kenosha, the municipal buildings are beautiful. The guy who built the library built Union Station, same architect.
It's gorgeous.
The courthouse is beautiful. The high school is beautiful. And when you look at the surrounding areas, it's like, it's the Rust Belt.
It's a rusted out industrial shell.
Yeah, and all of the jobs that used to exist there were shipped overseas. And that just brings us back to the present day, where Bernie Sanders was arguing for a lot of the same return of the dignity of the American worker and the bringing back the jobs that were offshored, the same thing that Trump was saying. So like, if you listen to Bernie Sanders saying, oh, we shipped 3 million jobs over to China, sounds like Donald Trump. And so Sanders got sandbagged by Hillary Clinton's campaign, as shown in the WikiLeaks emails.
Won the Wisconsin primary.
Yes, exactly. And so the DNC just so happened to have a stronger grip on who naming their candidate, anointing their candidate, than the Republicans did, because Trump was able to basically just hijack the Republican Party with this populist message of build a wall and bring back the jobs. And so everybody, points at Trump like as Orange Man bad, but it's like the ground was laid for this long before Trump ever even announced. And secondarily, the left made a huge mistake in, focusing on identity politics and with really favoring multinational businesses. And I cite in the Seattle chapter, the WTO. So Clinton signed NAFTA, which was a Bush-initiated trade policy, free trade in North America. And then at the end of his second term, he ushered in the World Trade Organization, which was essential in creating this global harmonious community. And you had the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, all these intellectuals who really were arguing for this laissez-faire economic policy, and obviously the left is against tariffs now, but the entire uniparty from Bush to Clinton to Bush 2 were cutting down all the barriers for companies to basically make money off of stuff made cheaply overseas and selling that stuff to Americans. What wasn't factored in was like, okay, well, where's the middle class going to be then? Because if we're not manufacturing, then what are the jobs going to be? And it's all in tech and it's all in services. And so if you work with your hands, it's hard for you to get a well-paying job.
There's this moment now where everyone's looking around at the culture and saying, this is the vibe shift, right? Like a lot of these young men, interestingly enough, are maybe some of the young men that used to go to Proud Boys or whatever are finding maybe more mainstream landing pads for their angst. I don't know. Maybe that's good. I'm channeling it into something that's more mainstream because some of these podcasters and the culture around the podcasts is actually like probably healthier than going and finding solace in the Proud Boys or wherever else. But the vibe shift, a lot of people on the right are feeling happy about it. But when I listen to you talk about all of these like sort of cultural consequences of economic restructuring, I think to myself, what is lying dormant in the United States right now, culturally?
Well, I think now that Trump won the popular vote, over the course of the last 8 years, after every election, it's like, okay, now let's dunk on our opponents. And so now that Trump won the popular vote, everybody's saying like, I'm getting so tired of winning. And that's, that's fine. Like everybody, and look, I get the jokes and I get all that. But with that being said, let's put it this way. If the conservative side of politics are supposed to be the ones who stand on their foundation of their principles, if they become reactionary, so the perfect example, Kyle Rittenhouse is a white supremacist. No, he's not. He's not a white supremacist. In fact, because you said that, I'm going to call him a hero. Nobody asked the question of like, I mean, some people did, but largely the narrative didn't ask the question of like, what kind of family, dad, mother, lets their 17-year-olds go out to a riot with an AR-15. I mean, is that, what kind of conservative family, well-built family who's looking after their kids is going to allow that to happen? Oh yeah, kid, I'll see you at 4 a.m. Have fun, honey, defending the business amongst all the fires.
And I remember that being very disillusioning for you, watching a lot of people on the right rally around.
And look, I knew I was kicking the hornet's nest by saying, Kyle's not a hero. He's also not a white supremacist. But the right only paid attention to the first half of that narrative. I'm not saying that he went out there with bad intentions. I'm not saying he's a white supremacist. But I am saying like we should ask the deeper question of like, why did all this happen? And so if the right is going to abandon that foundation and say, because you said this, I'm going to say that, then the left says, well, because you said that, I'm going to do this. There's no longer any ground to stand on, and that creates a death spiral. And so, now that the right is back in power, I think some grace would be warranted. And I'm not saying that the left afforded the right any kind of grace in the last 8 years, but I am saying that if you do come from a truly conservative background and Christians believe that every man and woman is born in the image of God and they have the right to get right with their maker before they die and make that choice on their own free will. And Joseph Rosenbaum, under his own free will, chased down Kyle and dove at his gun and missed and was shot and killed. But I watched him pass away and I watched the regret in his eyes. And so me just citing that experience and the impression that it left on my mind, not knowing who he was, just seeing the regret and learning why he was so regretful after the fact. Just citing that experience as, well, he deserved it, and he shouldn't even be talking about that. But we can't truly understand why these things happen and the spiritual sickness that pervades across the political spectrum unless we do examine it in that way. And so that more nuanced conversation, I think, even still today, now that Trump has won, everybody's really still stuck in these two trenches.
Right.
And I think it's now beholden to the political right, this broad coalition. So I'm not saying that the right is only conservatives now. That's certainly not the case. But now that they're back in power, have a little bit of compassion for, the fact that, okay, like, rather than telling you why you're wrong, why don't I ask you some questions? Why don't I use the Socratic method here? Like, why are you out here? Put a human face on somebody and you can decide for yourself. And that's why I wrote the book, is because, the videos, all that, it's all just pixels on the screen. But the experience of talking to these people on both sides of the political spectrum, my goal is to put a human face on these people, regardless of where they came from, regardless of what they did, so that the audience can decide for themselves and say, okay, well, I get a little bit more of why this happened. And that's the reason why at the beginning of the book, I talk about losing my dad, because everybody has issues with their parents, that's just standard. But my parents, regardless of the fact that they fought, they stayed together for my whole life. And all my friends who had divorced parents, they would come to our house to hang out. And my dad was like a hard ass. He was a doctor, and I resented him for that. Oh, dad's not chill. Dad's not cool. Mom's way more chill. Well, I found out that he came from 3 boys. His twin brother died from drugs before I could remember. His younger brother had 3 boys. I'm from 3 boys as well. And his younger brother never really turned his back on that life of drugs. And 3 of my 3 cousins, 2 of them have passed away from drug-related incidents. And I realized after my dad passed away, after asking all his friends, this totally renewed understanding of the struggles that he went through. And also the fact that he used to say, oh yeah, I paid for med school. I had a rich uncle. And turns out he smuggled some drugs to pay for med school. And sorry, Dad, in your name, but I do think that citing that really shows the way in which, after a tragedy, if you do really try to examine and ask people who were close to it why it happened, why he was this way, I realized, my dad turned his back on that life, and that he was a hard ass precisely because of the challenges that he faced growing up, and precisely because he watched his family fall apart. And his dad died when he was very young. And so having learned that after he passed away brought a certain amount of peace and a greater respect for what he was able to do for us. And I think you can do the same thing with an election, with a tragedy, a shooting, January 6th, whatever you want to call it, a riot. Obviously, people say insurrection. I don't agree with that. But if you actually look at the human faces of the people that were there and you try to understand who those human beings were and what motivated them to go there, and then how crazy chaos can cause people to do crazy things, I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying getting a greater understanding of it, I think, brings a certain amount of peace where you don't have to be so angry about it anymore.
It seems to me a lot of the causes that brought people into the streets, the psychological, emotional, personal causes, political causes that brought people into the streets, haven't really been solved. We still have a lot of lost souls, and we still have a lot of people struggling with broken homes, broken careers, bank accounts, and all of that. Can this happen again? Can 2020 happen again?
Certainly. And I think that all the ingredients are there with how divided our country is still. I talk a lot in the book about how our video business functioned, what clips were purchased, what clips went viral, what networks bought what clips, and also how this feed, not only are you exposed to, every rich person in their beautiful life, but also all the terrible things that are happening around the country instantly. Like before you have coffee, depending on who you follow, you can watch somebody fall off a cliff or get punched in the head or get shot. And so as if everybody's inundated with that kind of every bad thing that's happening around the country, you can take a perception that things are worse than they've ever been. I mean, if you look at crime rates, they have gotten worse recently, but if you compare it to the 70s, 80s, and 90s, in cities like New York, I mean, New York used to be, and DC too, at certain times were murder capitals of the United States. And we're not talking a couple hundred homicides. We're talking like 800, thousands of homicides a year. And so now today, it's really easy to think how dark things are. But, and the other, like you said, the family has been degraded and local communities. And so people no longer look to their church or their local community or their family for that insular community. It's now the national political tribe. Mm-hmm. And because of the digitization of our discourse and the collapse of local newspapers, no one's paying attention to local news politics. Mm-hmm. Everybody's paying attention to, that national stage. And so it's really easy to be animated by that national political tribe and forget about that core group of people who surround you. And that's why in the book, I just outline the fact that I wanted to, go crazy after these events and stamp my feet and scream and point my finger and call people names. And I was angry, but it was always my family and my close friends who said, or Jeff Ingersoll, who's a former jarhead, who'd say, calm down, let's go through the proper channels. CNN took your words out of context after the shooting in Kenosha. They took your words from Tucker Carlson out of context, and you might be mad about it, but let's go to their comms person. Let's work through this. And I go through every email that I sent to this, Matt Dornick is his name, and how exactly I was able to say, have me on to correct the record or effectively prepare for court. Yeah. And they did have me on to correct the record. And that was actually a very substantive story that broke down all those narrative barriers that were built up around it. And sure, that was just one story, but if that can serve as an example, the same thing happened after January 6th with New York Times, which I'll let the people wait for that book for those emails. But there's a couple corrections involved, more than one, more than two, but I'm not going to get into that. I'll let people tune into that. Yeah, but it was the same thing. On January 6th, I looked like a knuckle-dragging Trump supporter, and so they called me a rioter, and they claimed that I punched a door when I had actually lost my phone and been pepper sprayed 100 times. Right. And so the same thing is like that surface level. Look at this Neanderthalic looking guy who's crazy because I had been pepper sprayed and beaten, and I just suffered a massive concussion when those massive Capitol doors got smashed on my head. Now that I have the surveillance footage, thank you, MAGA Mike Johnson, for opening that up, because I followed myself skateboarding down to the Capitol and then going through and climbing a wall and following into the house. Anyways, I learned afterwards that it wasn't the police who shut the door on me. It was a woman who was getting pepper sprayed, and she wanted to close the door to stop the pepper spray, and it just smashed on my head. I didn't even remember that it was the door that hit my head. I don't even remember what happened there. But the New York Times took a photo of me in the darkest moment of one of the darkest moments of my whole life, and called me all these things when actually they had relied on my reporting after Kenosha, because the New York Times reporter left that day. And I don't blame her for going home. By all accounts, it was a good decision. But, the people who were there were Daily Caller, me, Jorge Shelby, Julio Rosas, Ford Fisher, Drew Hernandez, Elijah Schaefer, BG on the Scene, a bunch of local guys, Nathan DeBruin, Kristen Harris. All these people who were on the ground were all independents from small. And so the same thing on January 6th, like there were a lot of international press in there. I mean, obviously New York Times guy was in there with his camera, but all of the same people that I'm talking about right there were also at January 6th. And we were the ones who were inside of these protest zones just recording the footage. And, the corporate media was keen just to stand on the periphery and give their topical narrative. Well, it's a mostly peaceful atmosphere in here. Or, well, they're all insurrectionists, and so those platitudes don't really do anything to advance the ball of like, why is this stuff happening? So I guess a very long-winded way of saying, I do think the ingredients are still there, but hopefully I hope that from both sides, because I'm not saying that it's only beholden to the right to have some grace. I mean, the left our corporate media establishment has been completely detached from reality for too long. And they're sitting in their multi-million-dollar studios and they're saying, if you vote for this guy, then you're bad. And it's like, all right, dude, you're making $10 million a year. So it's pretty easy for you to say that from there. It's pretty easy for you to be virtuous from behind armed security. But if you're out in Kenosha and you're watching your entire city burn, that's a much different experience. And if you're actually next to these people who had that experience, it's different.
Yeah. Well, Richie, this has been fascinating, but to pluck one more example from your Forrest Gump-like arc, before I let you go, you know Kash Patel through your hockey league. Am I right?
Well, I don't know him like personally, and I knew always that he started playing in 17 or 18. I was like, oh yeah, this guy who works for the Trump administration for his, I think it was the NSC that he worked for previously, the National Security Council. Don't quote me on that, but he was within Trump's security apparatus, and I knew, okay, so that guy's got a very legit job, and I have a buddy who plays on his team, and so I always knew, of him, and I played against him, and I started writing like just watching some of his games when I show up in my games after his, like at an undisclosed location, Kash Patel ripped a slap shot at his teammate's head, or he held the blue line or threaded a pass. I've talked to everybody, not everybody, but a lot of the people on his team. And what I will say is, regardless of politics or anything like that, the people follow all across the political spectrum, they like having him on his team. And I think that's the thing about hockey is like all that stuff goes out the window, and it's a matter of like, are you there for your squad? And are you a good person to be around when you're having beers after your battle in the locker room? And so they all appreciate having him on their team. And that has nothing to do with skills or anything like that. It has to do with that camaraderie, that community. And like my hockey buddies from college through men's league, they're my best buddies to this day. And so that's what I'm talking about with that insular community that you have of like, okay, Richie, you did something pretty dumb. Okay, Richie, you're in the middle of the chaos again, but hey, like, we're here for you. And we'll still have a beer with you after the game, even if I don't agree with whatever political stance anybody has. So
I've joked before that Richie at protests, especially in 2020, used to have long hair.
Yeah.
It looks like McConaughey in True Detective.
Well, yeah, the older version though, the one who's been through the crowd.
Yeah.
During the trial, they called me the Ford Fiesta lawyer instead of the Lincoln lawyer.
Oh,
it's like a
that's
cheap,
good.
a budget version of it.
The Ford Fiesta.
All right.
Amazing. You're a wild man, Richie McGinniss.
Hey, I'm retiring. I got to retire from this protest beat.
Fair enough. Well,
so buy the book so that I don't have to go out there again.
There you go. Thank you so much for being here, Richie.
Thanks for having me.
I love long-form conversations to really go deep with Richie on his experiences in Kenosha, in Portland. It gave me a new understanding as I looked at some of the videos that have just come out over the last few days, some of the attempts to build on what happened before, but to do it in a new way. I just think this is unpredictable. And a lot of these pieces about the resistance just being dead, they could well prove to be true. I'm just not ruling anything out quite yet for a lot of the reasons we got to talk to Richie about. So it's not going to look like 2017 exactly, or 2018, or even 2020 exactly. I doubt we will ever see anything like 2020 again in our lifetimes. But we could see something more than what we're seeing now. And that could just change the incentive system for Republicans. It could change the way that we see each other again as a country, that corporations see their role in culture. So there's a lot more to come, I suspect, and we will be here covering all of it. So make sure to subscribe on the YouTube channel, subscribe wherever you download your podcasts. And if you want to join the Undercurrents community, go to undercurrents.tv. It's just $1 for your first month. You get all kinds of premium paywalled content. We are there every week with at least one premium episode, and we take your questions with an email address you can only get if you subscribe at undercurrents.tv. We will be back with more Undercurrents soon. Thanks for tuning in.